Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video, if you can see my face, or a podcast, if all you can hear is my voice. In this video and podcast, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and I, Mike Hutchinson, also a games designer, will be talking, as we are often found to do on the internet, about designing better miniature games. And we've been talking most recently about granularity and complexity and crunchiness and how much of all of these delicious crunchy things you should put in your game's design. And of course, there is a correct answer, and we will divine it now for you over the next 15 or 20 minutes. So, Glenn, do you want to give us a working definition of? Do you want to define crunchiness or complexity? Are they the same thing?
So, I mean, I definitely don't think that complexity and crunchiness are the same thing.
What?
I, so okay, by crunchiness, I mean sort of the engagement level of the game. How much your game is a sit forward game and how much is it a sit back game. If your game is very crunchy, then there are things that my brain hooks need to sort of clamp onto.
Now, are you talking there about like the pace or the pace of decision making or the impact of my decisions, or are you talking more generally about like the number of subsystems and the amount of like brain crunch and brain churning I have to do, or is it both, or is it neither?
Well, I think it's all and neither. Okay, so in relation to the idea of subsystems and complexity inherently creating crunchiness,
Mm.
chess or Go, right? I think they are very, very crunchy games. There is an enormous amount of brain testing, brain twisting, pressure and examination in those games. But the games themselves are immensely simplistic.
So if you can write a book about the strategy of them, it's crunchy.
Yeah, that would be certainly one way of putting it. If as you're playing, you are feeling the mental fatigue of the thing you're engaging with,
Mm.
then I think that's crunchy. And sometimes complexity creates depth, creates crunchiness, but not all the time and not inherently. And I think that one of the things you can spot in bad designs is that somebody has thought, I'll keep putting in complexity that will eventually create a game that is crunchy. And it's just not necessarily true. Complexity always results in busy work. It
Yep.
always results in steps and processes and moments to go through. But if none of those steps and complexities are like interlocking, and if none of them are inherently sort of crunchy in and of themselves, then all you get is like layers of process. And that can be absolutely fine. And that's not an inherent problem as long as you know what you want and you know the tools you're going to have to apply to achieve what you want. If you want a game that is about like, you know, I think it's a lot of time what are termed Ameritrash games have a lot of complexity and a lot of granularity, but they don't have very much crunchiness. Some do, but a lot of them don't. Because what they're about is sort of going through a narrative experience where if you're like, well, what I want to do is I want to shove the bookcase in front of the door to block the monster, and then I want to smash through the window with this chair, and then somebody else is like, well, no, what I want to do is I'm going to set fire to the bed sheets and throw them over the monster, and then I'm going to climb through the roof hatch. In order to allow all those different things, the game's going to have loads of complexity, loads of granularity, but
Right,
don't
and I think
necessarily crunch at all.
yeah, and I think that there's an interesting point about crunch is that it's perfectly fine for it's perfectly possible for a game to be extremely engaging and fun without necessarily being crunchy, because
Yeah.
what it's engaging is your imagination or your storytelling at the table or something. I really liked when you were saying about the fact that like if complexity can mean mechanics are present but they're not interlocking, and I
Mhm.
think that that's one of the things that I think crunch comes from, is like if you have managed to find ways for the teeth to click together so that you create tension between the mechanics and tension between the decisions. And so if I make this decision, it's going to make this other decision harder, or it's going to make this thing easier for you, but but work out for me at some later junctions. I think that, like, because chess only has what, like, 12 or 15 actual rules in it, but the way that they interlock creates a bunch of tension and a bunch of potential outcomes and sticky situations. And I think the same is definitely true in a tabletop miniatures game, or like in a skirmish game, where you might have a rule about your gun jamming. Now, that might be something that's just a throwaway thing that you put in because sometimes guns jam in movies and you wanted to have that narrative moment. Or it could be that there is, an action cost to unjamming your gun, and that is a carefully balanced economy where that action is really important to you. And so now, whether or not you shoot someone with a gun, which would normally be a really obvious non-decision, suddenly becomes like it's a bit of a rusty old flintlock. It jams 1 out of 3 times. I'm going to need the action to unjam it later to grab the idol or whatever. Like, now we've got tension, and now we've got something that feels crunchy because of that extra complexity.
Yeah, and to sort of like unpick a couple of metaphors in relation to the fact that we were talking about granularity last week, and the fact that people, I think, confuse granularity and crunchiness. Granularity, I think, is called granularity because it's about how much
How big the grains are. How big
you can see of the thing. Can you see down to the actual grains of sand in the game? Crunchiness, I think, is called crunchiness because you're whizzing along and the gears of your brain are spinning around, and then a bit of sand gets into those gears and they go on the bit of sand. And if, when that happens, it's a pleasurable experience, you're like, oh, I've got to bite down on this. It's a delicious sandwich. It's not just like marshmallow. It's something chewy and steaky. All the process of chewing and grinding it down into what I want is pleasurable, and that's great. If it's like, oh, I'm in an amazing flow state, this is brilliant, this is back and forth, and then it just grinds to a halt, and everyone's like, oh, I just
right, yeah. Or a really classic example of this during playtesting is when you get to the 4th turn of the game and you realize everyone has forgotten that rule that you're supposed to check on every unit every time they're activated, and you'll be like, oh, well, that's clearly a rule too many. That's a piece of complexity that no one at this table is asking for, and no one seems to be missing.
And I think one of the things sometimes that fans of strategy and tactics forget, because sometimes I think people who like very crunchy games, like these sort of highfalutin competitive puzzle situations, it's very delicious. One of the issues with it is that tactical smoothness allows for like speed and a lot of interaction between players at a tabletop.
Right.
The fewer things that you are having to interact as an interim between you and the other person, the more directly your two brains can sort of clinging into each other, and
challenge each other.
The crunchiest thing you'll ever encounter during any game is another human being's thought processes and brain fruits. A very, very, very crunchy game as sort of interims between you and the other person. And a lot of the time, with a very, very crunchy game, it's who can get into the crunch of the game best and then use it to hit the other person with, rather than who can actually sometimes outwit directly the other guy at the tabletop. So it's not inherently true that a very, very crunchy game even is a very, very tactical or strategic or necessarily mentally challenging game, weirdly enough. It's like, if you happen to tap into the crunchiness of the game and run through the puzzles and enjoy that, that can be a certain sort of mental taxation. But sometimes it's way, the number of times I've played Warhammer and I've battered smarter people because I had done the crunch of the game better than they had. And it doesn't matter how smart you are. If I've crunched the army numbers and you haven't, I'm going to batter you, because that's the nature of that game. And that's fine. And it is the thing it is. But it's not like Go or chess or things of that nature, which are much more much more direct in their crunchiness, much more interactive, and tactically smoother, but crunchier in their overall body. So it's worth considering if you want a game that feels close and tight and intense in its struggle, maybe taking out some of the game design crunchiness to it.
Yeah, and I think that you've been talking enthusiastically about crunch, and I think it is often a very good thing. But as you mentioned, there are other kinds of joy to be extracted, and even when it comes to tabletop miniature games, which tend towards the slightly more simulationist. You've got people moving in these in these infinite graduations of inches on the tabletop, and you potentially checking true line of sight through little bushes and so forth. Like all of that, I think all of that like model making and non-discreteness sort of ends up suggesting quite strongly a level of kind of complexity and detailed faffing about that I certainly have often in my designs tried to push quite hard against, and try and surprise people with the fact that you don't have to worry about all the minutiae that you might expect to have to worry about. But having said that, like there are, or rather, and I think that's because there are other kinds of experiences of pleasure at the table where you aren't necessarily engaged in a Herculean battle of strategic wits, and that's the main pleasure. Because there are plenty of beer and pretzels type miniature games where the fun of pushing things around and rolling dice comes out through some other mechanics, and there's some kind of fun ways of the stuff interacting in a much lighter way. And then you've got games all the way over on the other extreme where it's so crunchy and it's such an investment of brain energy to just even get the machine to run correctly that you have to be maybe in a particular mood, or you have to be fairly well rested in order to get the most out of that game, because it's going to be 120 of the most intense minutes of your gaming year whilst you play that.
Yeah, and I think it's about making a decision about the sort of intensity of the engagement level of your game. And understanding that that doesn't necessarily, like I say, doesn't necessarily relate to complexity. It doesn't necessarily relate to game length. I mean, I've known like wargamers who love particularly mechanized sort of combat era ship battle games. And they have these very, very detailed games where they're rolling absolute buckets of dice at each other that essentially do nothing. And I've watched them for a while, and I've been like, there don't seem to be any actual tactics to the game. And they're like, yeah, no, of course there aren't. I don't care at all. We roll up and we shoot at each other and we see what happens. And it takes about 4 hours. And there are masses and masses of tables and detailed, complexity of every gun. I know the bore of every single gun on the ship. And that's delightful. I love that.
Right, and there is a pleasure in I'm a particular proponent of the pleasure of just operating the machine. Is often, for me, if the machine is nice enough to work, then I'll want to go in and pull the levers. And as you've commented to me before, sometimes in absence of even considering the victory conditions, because I'm just like, well, the victory condition is me pulling these levers and seeing arms move, and that's brilliant.
I've already won. I got
exactly. You can tell me what the victory points are if you like, but it doesn't make a blind bit of difference.
Yeah, and this is the thing, and this returns to, and I think a few of these conversations around now are going to be about picking what your game is about and delivering it and unapologetically and stylishly. And like I say, if your game is about sitting back and letting people push the levers and maneuver things around and just enjoy the processes, it doesn't need to be crunchy. If your game is about somebody going in and engaging with the puzzle of the game, the sort of the pre-built structures and gears and things that you've put in there, and they're going to get loads of lovely sweeties when they find the right gears to mesh together, then yeah, it has to be crunchy. But if your game is about two people mentally wrestling at the tabletop, you might think you need to put a lot of crunch in there, but that's not what that's not what is required for that to occur. Like I say, you look at a game like Go, incredibly simple, tiny number of rules, and immensely sort of mentally engaging between two people. The game design itself doesn't necessarily be crunchy to produce a crunchy game. Complexity is not inherently related to crunchiness. Granularity can be, but doesn't have to be. These are all separate things, and they're all things that you're going to need to decide how much salt and how much pepper and whatnot that you want in your particular recipe. And the thing about these chats are, is despite what Mike rather flippantly said in the introduction, there aren't right or wrong answers. There's a right and wrong answer for your design, and one of the
and it's totally reversible during the design process, because you can put rules back in, you can put a load of rules in and take them out. Like it's just work that you can do or not do to figure out. You can go one way, you can go the other, and you can try them both out. See if anyone misses them, or see if recently I dramatically simplified the victory conditions for Hobgoblin, which I'm working on at the moment. And I thought, oh, no one wants this complicated subsystem that I find delightful. And then the playtesters were like, we're bored of playing the normal victory conditions. Is there any other way of resolving victory? And I was like, well, here, I've got it from 6 months ago. Let me put it back in again.
Yeah, these are all movable feasts, and you can twiddle it back and forth. And I think sort of in developing games and in working on other people's games, one of the saddest things is when somebody is trying to do one thing, and because they think you're meant to have one of these and you're meant to have one of those, it's meant to work like this, and okay, well, I've put a shooting system in, so now I've got to make it a really good shooting system. And it's like, but your game didn't want a shooting system anyway, and now in making the shooting system that you put in good, you've made it long and intensive and all these sorts of things. And that's great if your game was a different sort of game, but your game isn't this game. Why did you do that to your game? And it's very easy, particularly as a first-time designer, and I think particularly when you get deep in the bushes in a particular game, to lose sight of what it was meant to be and start doing things because you think that's what you're meant to do. Or again, sometimes you're working on design, and there's the thing that you need to fix, and then there's the thing that you can do, and you end up doing the thing that you can do rather than the thing that you need to fix. And then this thing ends up being enormous, kind of crushing the, sometimes you need to stop and go, okay, what was this meant to be about again? Not this. Well, then I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to go and do the thing it was meant to be about. But yes, crunchiness is a thing that not every game needs. A thing that you shouldn't assume you need just because there's a certain gaming cognoscenti who delight in crunchylarity.
Well, look, I have a regular opponent, Rufus, and we tried playing some Malifaux the other day, and he'd forgotten how crunchy it was, and it gave him a headache, and we haven't played it again. It was like, it took 3 hours because we'd forgotten what the rules were, and there's millions of them.
Yeah, and it's they Malifaux does very nicely for it.
And now he just wants to play Frostgrave instead because
yeah,
it's a different level of crunch.
Yes, none of them are right or wrong. There are 9 and 20 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. And you can do it however you like, as long as you do it the way that works for the thing you're doing. Pick your battles and win them. Okay, so that has been a nice little chat about crunchiness. If you've watched through to this point on the video and you enjoy what we do, please like and subscribe. If you don't like what we do, like and subscribe anyway. It's not going to
just your day. Yeah, that'll show us.
Drop us a comment in the comment section. If you're the sort of person that likes dropping comments in comment sections, why not stop by our Discord? We have a Discord.
It's like one big comment section.
Basically, yeah, it's a live action comment section in which people are having lovely conversations about game design and crunchiness and granularity, and crunchy conversations about games design, which is a whole other interesting, wonderful thing. So stop by there. The link is in the show notes down there. Other than that, look us up on social media. We are around and available. We are people in the world. You can probably find and assault us with opinions. That said, I think that's going to be it for this week. So I think we'll sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage and say goodbye.
Bye bye.